Most investors don't lose their wealth because the market crashes or the economy collapses. They lose it because they spent decades pretending comfort was the same thing as freedom, and by the time they realized the difference, it was already too late. If you value clear thinking and financial honesty over empty promises and hype, consider subscribing to this channel, because what we discuss here isn't about getting rich quick, it's about staying rational long enough to actually build something that lasts. Let me start with a truth that most people over 40 have learned the hard way, often after years of sleepless nights and mounting credit card bills. The system we live in doesn't actually want you wealthy. It wants you comfortable, just comfortable enough that you stop questioning your choices, just secure enough that you keep working, spending, and borrowing without ever pausing to ask whether any of it makes sense. You get a raise at work, and within weeks you've upgraded your car. You receive a year-end bonus, and suddenly you're looking at bigger homes in better neighborhoods. You think you're rewarding yourself for hard work, and in a way you are, but what you're really doing is upgrading your liabilities while your assets remain stagnant or non-existent. The banks smile because they just locked you into another loan. The government collects more taxes because your spending increased. The corporations that sold you that shiny new object are thrilled because you've become a repeat customer. Everyone in this equation is getting richer except you, and the tragic part is that you don't even notice it happening because it all feels so normal, so expected, so justified. Wealth, in its truest and most practical sense, is not about how much money you earn in a given year. It's about what remains after you subtract all the foolish decisions, the impulsive purchases, the status-driven spending, and the debt that quietly devoured your future while you were busy looking successful. The middle class in America has become extraordinarily skilled at one particular art, and that art is looking rich while remaining financially average or even fragile. Nice cars sit in driveways financed over 7 years. Kitchens get remodeled with money borrowed against home equity. Vacations to Europe or the Caribbean are funded by credit cards that carry interest rates most people couldn't even explain if you asked them. And then these same people sit at their kitchen tables late at night, wondering why compounding, that magical force they've heard so much about, never seems to show up at their door and transform their lives the way it's supposed to. Here's something Charlie Munger understood deeply, and something that separates those who build wealth from those who merely look like they have it. The middle class calls their mortgage an investment, as if signing a 30-year loan for a house they can barely afford is the same thing as buying shares in a profitable business. They call their car a necessity, even when a vehicle half the price would serve the exact same function. They call their credit card points free money, as though the interest they pay and the overspending those points encourage don't cost them 10 times more than the rewards are worth. They even call their debt manageable, a word that sounds responsible but really just means they've accepted financial bondage as a permanent condition. This isn't financial literacy. This is self-delusion with paperwork, a beautifully wrapped package of rationalizations that allows smart, hard-working people to stay trapped for decades. When Charlie Munger was young, during the Great Depression, people saved first and spent later because they had no choice, and because that discipline was culturally ingrained. Today, the script has flipped entirely. People spend first and pray later, hoping that somehow their income will keep rising, that the economy will keep humming along, that nothing unexpected will disrupt their delicate balance. They've confused motion with progress, mistaking a busy life full of payments and obligations for actual forward momentum. You know what happens when an entire nation lives beyond its means, when millions of households are perpetually one paycheck away from disaster. It turns into a society of slaves, not to kings or dictators, but to creditors, banks, and financial institutions that profit from every misstep, every moment of impatience, every decision driven by emotion rather than reason. And the middle class, with all its education and opportunity, is leading that parade. Munger saw this pattern repeat itself throughout his life. He watched smart engineers, talented lawyers, successful doctors, people with impressive degrees and high incomes, work 60 or 70 hours a week just to keep up with their own bad decisions. They don't own their homes in any meaningful sense. Their homes own them, dictating where they can work, when they can retire, and how much risk they can afford to take. They don't drive their cars freely. Their loans drive their choices, forcing them to stay in jobs they dislike, in cities they'd rather leave, because they can't afford to disrupt the payment schedule. That's not success, no matter how it looks from the outside. That's a treadmill with marble flooring, an exhausting routine dressed up to look like achievement. People love to criticize the poor for wasting money on lottery tickets, and there's some truth to that criticism. But here's the paradox that nobody wants to acknowledge. The middle class wastes just as much money, sometimes more, on status symbols, on the appearance of success, on keeping up with neighbors and coworkers who are just as broke as they are. Meanwhile, the truly wealthy, the people who have built real, lasting fortunes, quietly buy assets that nobody claps for, investments that don't photograph well, businesses that don't impress anyone at dinner parties. They understand something fundamental that the middle class has forgotten or perhaps never learned. The more you try to look rich, the longer you stay broke. The more invisible your wealth, the safer it grows and the more options it creates for you down the line. What financial mistake taught you your most painful lesson? Share it below. Because the truth is, most of us over 40 have made at least one significant financial error, whether it was taking on too much debt, chasing an investment we didn't understand, or simply spending years without a plan. These lessons, as painful as they are, often become the foundation for better decisions going forward. The average American, and this includes many people who consider themselves financially responsible, can't handle boredom. They crave stimulation, even when that stimulation costs them their future. So they swipe credit cards for small purchases that add up. They upgrade phones, furniture, and appliances on payment plans. They refinance their homes to access equity they haven't truly earned. And they repeat these patterns for decades, never stopping long enough to ask whether any of it serves their actual interests. They'll spend 30 years paying for a home but never spend 30 minutes trying to understand how compounding interest works. They'll know the horsepower and acceleration specs of their car but not the interest rate on their credit card or the fees buried in their investment accounts. This isn't simple ignorance. This is chosen blindness, a willful refusal to look at the numbers because looking means admitting they've been playing a losing game. The middle class doesn't fail because of lack of opportunity, especially in a country like America where information is free and financial tools are accessible. They fail because of a lack of restraint. They refuse to delay gratification, and they call that refusal living in the moment, as if enjoying life requires constant consumption. But here's what Munger knew and what every person who's built lasting wealth understands. You don't get rich by chasing comfort. You get rich by enduring discomfort intelligently, by making choices that feel slightly painful in the short term but compound beautifully over decades. If you need every purchase to feel justified, if you need to rationalize every expense with phrases like I deserve it or I work hard for my money, you'll never be free. Freedom requires saying no to most things, and the middle class can't say no, not to gadgets, not to houses that stretch their budget, not to trends that promise to make them feel relevant. That's why they'll stay in debt forever while telling themselves they're doing fine, while comparing themselves to people who are even more broke and feeling relieved. The middle class doesn't need more financial advice. They've heard it all before. They need a mirror, an honest reflection that shows them the truth. The biggest trap isn't the interest rate on their mortgage or the fees on their credit card. It's the illusion that everything's okay, the comfortable delusion that their current path leads somewhere good. And when you live like that long enough, surrounded by others doing the same thing, you stop noticing the bars on your golden cage. Debt, as Munger often pointed out, is like alcohol. 1 glass feels harmless, even pleasant. 2 makes you social and confident. But by the 5th glass, you're making stupid promises you can't keep, commitments that will haunt you when you sober up. The middle class calls debt leverage, a sophisticated financial tool that allows them to access opportunities they couldn't otherwise afford. Munger called it what it actually is, self-imposed servitude, a choice to borrow your way into a lifestyle your discipline hasn't earned. They think they're playing offense, making smart moves that accelerate their path to wealth. But they're really cornered on defense, paying interest to people who were smarter than them, who understood the math better, who recognize that the best position in any debt relationship is being the lender, not the borrower. Entire generations have convinced themselves that good debt exists, that some forms of borrowing are not only acceptable but wise and necessary. Let me tell you what Munger believed. Debt is only good when someone else owes it to you. When you're the one receiving the interest payments, when you're the one with optionality and control, that's when debt works in your favor. But a mortgage, a student loan, a car loan, a credit card balance, these are the four horsemen of financial mediocrity, and yet the middle class welcomes each of them with open arms and a smile, genuinely believing they're making responsible adult decisions. They'll tell you, with complete sincerity, that their mortgage is an investment, that borrowing for a home is fundamentally different from other kinds of debt. And sure, there's some truth to that if you buy wisely, if you can truly afford the payments, if the house fits your life rather than straining it. But that's not how most people buy homes. They buy the maximum the bank approves, not the minimum they can live with comfortably. They treat the lender's assessment of what they can afford as permission to stretch every dollar. An investment that guarantees 20 or 30 years of payments and zero optionality isn't really an investment. It's a commitment that removes flexibility from your life at precisely the moment when flexibility might matter most. Optionality, that's what wealth really buys. It's the ability to walk away from a bad situation, to say no to opportunities that don't serve you, to not care what the market, your boss, or the bank thinks about your choices. You can't have optionality when your life is pre-sold to creditors, when every month requires you to make specific payments or lose everything you've worked for. The middle class has turned the word loan into a love language. They borrow for college, for weddings, for furniture, even for vacations, and then they brag about their credit score as if it's a badge of honor, proof of their financial sophistication. But here's a secret that the financial industry doesn't want you to fully grasp. Your credit score measures how well you've played by the lender's rules. It's not a sign of intelligence or financial health. It's a sign of compliance, proof that you've borrowed money and paid it back according to terms that benefited the lender more than they benefited you. If the system rewards you for debt, if it encourages you to borrow more by offering you better rates and higher limits, maybe the system isn't designed for your freedom. Maybe it's designed to keep you productive, obedient, and perpetually in need of the next paycheck. Munger saw this movie before, multiple times throughout his long life. In 1929, Americans borrowed to buy stocks, convinced that the market would keep rising forever. In 2008, they borrowed to buy homes, certain that real estate prices could only go up. In both cases, when the music stopped, when reality reasserted itself, debtors were the ones left standing without chairs. The middle class still hasn't learned this lesson. They borrow today believing tomorrow will be richer, because hope is easier than discipline, because optimism feels better than caution. They don't realize how fragile their comfortable life actually is. One layoff, one serious illness, one market crash, and their entire financial structure collapses overnight. Munger never met a man who lost his house because he didn't have debt. But he met thousands who lost everything because they had just a little too much, because they pushed their leverage just slightly beyond what they could handle when circumstances changed. Debt doesn't just steal your money, though it certainly does that through interest payments that compound against you. It steals your calm, your time, your ability to think independently. When you owe someone money, when your monthly obligations exceed your comfort zone, you start filtering every decision through fear. Fear of losing your job. Fear of not making the next payment. Fear of admitting you've overextended yourself. That fear quietly corrodes your judgment, and judgment, as Munger emphasized throughout his career, is everything in investing and in life. When you're leveraged, when debt hangs over you, you can't be patient. You can't sit through market volatility without panicking. You can't think long-term because your short-term obligations demand immediate attention. You can't even think straight because the stress of debt creates a constant background noise that interferes with clear reasoning. The middle class loves to say you have to take risks to grow, to build wealth, to get ahead. And yes, that's true. But not stupid risks. Not the kind of risks that can wipe you out completely, that leave you with nothing if circumstances shift. You don't get rich by playing Russian roulette with borrowed bullets. The irony that Munger often pointed out is that the middle class thinks debt is the bridge to opportunity, the tool that allows them to access a better life sooner. In reality, it's a moat around their own prison. They decorate that prison with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. They call it a dream home and feel proud of it. And then they spend the next 30 years guarding the keys, protecting their investment, staying in jobs they hate because they can't risk losing the income that keeps the whole structure from collapsing. Meanwhile, the wealthy use debt like a scalpel, rarely, precisely, and only when the odds are overwhelmingly in their favor, only when they fully understand the risks and have multiple backup plans. The middle class uses debt like a hammer, hitting everything that looks shiny, borrowing for wants they've convinced themselves are needs. Debt isn't evil in itself. It's just a test of judgment, discipline, and self-awareness. And most people fail that test not because they're unintelligent but because they crave the shortcut. They think they can borrow their way into a lifestyle their discipline hasn't earned yet. That's the real middle-class trap, the fundamental error that leads to decades of stress and limitation. They confuse credit with capital, access to borrowed money with actual wealth, and they spend the rest of their lives learning the difference the hard way, through payments, through lost opportunities, through the slow realization that they're working for everyone except themselves. Here's something you need to remember, especially if you're over 40 and looking at your financial situation with honest eyes. If you need to borrow money to look successful, you've already failed the most important test. Because true wealth is silent, slow, and self-funded. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require validation. The moment you need other people's money to maintain your image, to keep up appearances, to feel like you're winning, you're not building freedom. You're renting it. And one day, sooner than you think, the rent always comes due. Comfort, that seemingly innocent goal that everyone pursues, has become the new poverty. Most people don't get trapped because they're unintelligent or lazy. They get trapped because they're comfortable enough not to change, satisfied enough not to question, secure enough not to think deeply about where their current path actually leads. The middle class loves comfort more than truth. They'll complain about inflation, about debt, about taxes, about the system being rigged against them. But not enough to actually do anything substantial about it. They want security, not freedom, because security feels warm and familiar while freedom feels uncertain and demanding. So they pick the sofa over the struggle every single time. Munger saw this pattern repeat itself thousands of times throughout his life. A man earns $50,000 a year and tells himself that when he hits $100,000, he'll finally start saving seriously, he'll finally start investing, he'll finally get his financial life in order. Then he hits $100,000 and discovers that life somehow got more expensive. His expectations rose. His lifestyle expanded. His circle changed. And suddenly 100,000 feels as tight as 50,000 used to feel. So he tells himself that when he hits 200,000, that's when things will really click. By the time he reaches that number, if he ever does, he's 45 years old, tired, stressed, and still essentially broke despite the impressive income. The problem was never his earning power. It was his thermostat, his internal set point for what constitutes comfortable. Every time life warms up financially, he resets comfort to a higher level. He thinks progress means owning more things, living in a better neighborhood, driving a nicer car. But the more you own, the more you owe, not just in money but in time, attention, maintenance, and mental energy. Every new gadget, every subscription service, every upgrade, they don't just cost money. They cost focus. And focus, the ability to think clearly about what actually matters, is the real capital of a rational mind. You can't think independently when your head is full of noise, full of obligations, full of things that demand your attention. You can't build wealth when you're addicted to convenience, when every minor inconvenience feels intolerable. The middle class has built an entire economy around their own desire for ease. They pay for fast food because cooking requires effort and planning. They pay for endless streaming services because boredom feels unbearable, because sitting quietly with their own thoughts seems impossible. They pay for convenience delivery because planning ahead, because thinking even one day into the future, feels like too much work. They don't see it as laziness or weakness. They call it self-care, they call it balance, they call it treating themselves well. Meanwhile, every swipe of the card, every click of the mouse, every delivery order funnels money to people and companies that understand exactly how comfort destroys discipline. Capitalism doesn't punish stupidity directly. It monetizes it. It turns your weaknesses into someone else's profit stream. If you make comfort your primary goal, if you optimize your life for ease rather than growth, someone smarter will sell it to you at a premium and get rich in the process. People love to talk about passive income, about money working for them while they sleep. But the truth that nobody wants to hear is that they are the passive income. They work, they consume, they repeat. The machine runs beautifully and efficiently, extracting value at every step. It just doesn't run for them. The middle class wants wealth without inconvenience. They want to save without sacrifice. They want to invest without risk. They want to learn without the discomfort of confronting their own ignorance. That's like wanting to lose weight without ever feeling hungry, like wanting to build strength without ever feeling sore. Munger spent his entire life watching people underestimate the cost of comfort, watching smart people turn into dull ones because they stopped pushing themselves, stopped questioning, stopped growing. Comfort turns sharp minds into soft ones. It teaches you to tolerate mediocrity, to rationalize stagnation, to accept good enough when better is possible. When you're too comfortable, you stop asking what could be different, what could be improved, what you might be missing. And when you stop asking those questions, life quietly passes you by while you watch television and scroll through social media. Discomfort, properly understood and intelligently embraced, is the seed of growth. Every good decision Munger ever made started from some form of irritation or dissatisfaction. He was irritated by ignorance, by waste, by stupidity, by inefficiency. That irritation forced him to learn, to adapt, to move forward rather than settle. The middle class calls discomfort stress. Something to be medicated, avoided, or outsourced. The wealthy call discomfort tuition, the price you pay to get smarter, to see more clearly, to understand more deeply. If you can't stand temporary pain, whether it's the pain of saying no to yourself, the pain of looking foolish while you learn something new, or the pain of living below your means while everyone around you spends freely, you'll end up with permanent regret. Here's the irony that should make you pause and think. The middle class will endure 30 years of job anxiety, debt pressure, relationship stress caused by money problems, and general financial unease, all to avoid 6 months or a year of real discipline and sacrifice. That's comfort addiction at its finest, at its most destructive. They'll stay in jobs they genuinely hate, in neighborhoods they can't actually afford, trapped in habits that slowly bleed them dry. Not because they have no choice, not because they're truly stuck, but because they've mistaken comfort for happiness, because changing would require admitting they've been wrong, because the known misery feels safer than the unknown possibility. Comfort is not a worthy goal for your life. It's a narcotic. Taken too long, used too frequently, it dulls your ambition, clouds your judgment, weakens your character. And once it does that, the market doesn't even need to defeat you. You'll do it to yourself through 1,000 small surrenders. So if you want to stop being broke, if you want to build something real, start being uncomfortable on purpose. Read books and articles that challenge you, that make you feel ignorant until you understand them. Cut expenses that make you feel safe but serve no real purpose. Invest in something that scares you a little bit, that requires you to learn and grow. Because the more you chase comfort, the more it costs you, and not just in dollars. It costs you the one thing that compounds faster than money ever could, and that's character. Without character, without the ability to delay gratification and make hard choices, no fortune can save you from yourself. Which of Munger's principles do you find hardest to apply consistently? Let's talk in the comments. Because knowing what to do and actually doing it are two very different things, especially when emotions, social pressure, and decades of conditioning pull you in the opposite direction. The middle class doesn't just want to live well. They want to look like they live better than everyone else, and that's the trap, the quiet poison called status. Most people don't buy a car to solve a transportation problem. They buy attention, validation, proof that they've made it. They don't buy a house to create shelter. They buy approval from neighbors, relatives, and co-workers who frankly don't care nearly as much as they think. And that's why they'll always struggle financially, because they're trying to purchase self-worth from people who have their own problems and insecurities. When Munger was young, nobody cared if you wore an expensive watch. If you had one, it probably meant you were late to something important. Today, a watch has become a personality statement, a conversation starter, a way to signal status without saying a word. People earning $50,000 a year wear $10,000 on their wrist, financing the difference through payment plans and credit cards, and they call it motivation or investment in themselves. Munger would call it insanity, a complete inversion of rational thinking. The middle class lives by an unspoken rule that governs their every purchase. If I can look rich, maybe someday I'll feel rich, maybe I'll actually become rich. It never works that way. You can't buy confidence with consumption. You can't fill an empty ego with a new gadget or designer label. Munger met billionaires throughout his life who drove old cars and lived in modest homes, not because they were cheap or eccentric, but because they were genuinely free. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. And that's exactly why they stayed rich while others who looked wealthy stayed broke. Status seeking is the most expensive hobby on earth. It's the reason people stay trapped in jobs they hate just to maintain appearances. It's why they buy things they don't need with money they don't have to impress people they don't even like. You know what's worse than being broke? Being broke while pretending you're not, spending every dollar trying to maintain an illusion that exhausts you. Social media made this disease terminal. Now everyone's a performer, their life a carefully curated stage. The set is your feed. The costume is your possessions. The applause comes in likes and comments, fake validation that's somehow become addictive. People don't measure success by actual wealth anymore, by freedom or options or peace of mind. They measure it by envy, by how many people wish they had what you appear to have. You buy the same phone everyone else has. You wear the same brands. You drive the same model car. And you feel like you're keeping up, like you're winning. But you're not. You're just running the same rat race in more expensive shoes. There's nothing inherently wrong with nice things if you can truly afford them and they bring genuine value to your life. But when those things own you, when your identity depends on them, when you can't imagine being respected without them, you've traded freedom for decoration. Here's a simple test that reveals where you stand. If the market collapsed tomorrow and nobody could see what you own, if all your possessions disappeared and you had to rebuild based purely on who you are, would you still feel successful? If the answer is no, congratulations, you're a prisoner of appearances. The truly wealthy understand that real status doesn't come from display. It comes from control, from having power over your time, your choices, your emotional state. The middle class has the opposite. They trade control for applause, real freedom for temporary validation. They'll work overtime to afford a luxury car they barely drive, then complain they never have time for their family or hobbies. They'll chase promotions they don't actually need just to upgrade their LinkedIn headline or impress people at high school reunions. That's not ambition. That's vanity disguised as progress. And vanity is a terrible investment. It pays no dividends, compounds no interest, and depreciates the moment you buy it. People say money doesn't buy happiness, and that's true. But spending money trying to look rich definitely buys misery, stress, and a life of quiet desperation. Envy is a tax, and most people pay it voluntarily, eagerly, repeatedly. The middle class keeps trying to signal wealth through visible consumption while the truly wealthy quietly collect assets that actually generate returns. Warren Buffett once said you can't tell who's swimming naked until the tide goes out. Munger would add that you can't tell who's truly free until the applause stops, until the audience leaves, until you're alone with your actual financial reality. So stop performing for an audience that doesn't care about your long-term well-being. Stop chasing validation from people who are just as confused as you are. Stop buying symbols and start buying options, real financial options that give you freedom rather than obligations. Because when you live to impress others, you'll always need an audience, always need external validation. But when you live by reason, by your own carefully considered values, you'll never need permission from anyone. And that kind of status, that kind of self-respect, is something money can't buy but financial discipline can build. Nothing traps the middle class more beautifully, more completely, than a house they call a dream home. They say renting is throwing money away, wasting resources on something you'll never own. And Munger would respond that paying interest for 30 years on something you barely control is equally wasteful, perhaps more so because it creates the illusion of ownership. The obsession with homeownership is one of the most effective financial sedatives ever invented by the modern economic system. It keeps people working without questioning, borrowing without hesitation, and staying geographically locked in place. Exactly what banks and governments prefer. When Munger was young, a house was understood as shelter, a place to live, nothing more romantic than that. Now it's become a status symbol, an ego project, an Instagram background, and a lifetime mortgage disguised as stability and smart investing. The middle class will stretch every dollar, sign every document the bank puts in front of them, and handcuff themselves to a 30-year loan just to say they own four walls that technically still belong to the bank until that final payment decades from now. They'll spend weekends mowing lawns they can't really afford, remodeling kitchens that don't add proportional value, and convincing themselves it's all an investment that will pay off. Let me ruin that fantasy with some uncomfortable truth. Your primary residence isn't an investment in any meaningful financial sense. It's an illiquid emotional liability with a roof. It doesn't produce cash flow. It demands cash flow constantly. Property taxes, insurance, maintenance, repairs, upgrades that feel mandatory, homeowners association fees, the costs hide everywhere. These expenses alone, over decades, could fund a substantial stock portfolio that actually generates passive income. And yet people call their home their greatest asset, their best investment, the smartest decision they ever made. That's like calling your dog your retirement plan. Sure, you love it, it provides value, but it's not generating the returns you need for financial independence. Of course, owning a home can make sense if you buy wisely, if you can truly afford it without straining, if it fits your actual life rather than your ego or your image of what success looks like. But that's not how most people buy real estate. They don't buy what they can comfortably afford. They buy the maximum the bank approves, treating the lender's assessment as permission rather than a warning. The mortgage broker says you're approved for $500,000, and instead of thinking maybe I should spend $300,000 to maintain flexibility, people go full throttle. Why? Because the middle class measures success by square footage, by the neighborhood name, by whether their home impresses visitors. It's madness dressed up as normal adult behavior. Munger saw people living in million-dollar homes with $2,000 in their bank account, and that's not security, that's theater, financial performance art. They'll justify it by saying property always goes up in value, real estate never fails. Really? Tell that to the millions of people who learned otherwise in 2008 when the housing market collapsed and destroyed retirement plans, college funds, and entire life savings. Housing can be a reasonable store of value if you buy wisely, hold long-term, and don't confuse it with income-producing assets. But the middle class treats their house like an ATM machine. They refinance to pay for vacations. They borrow against equity to remodel. They celebrate paper wealth that exists only in appraisals and Zillow estimates. Then a recession hits and suddenly they're back to zero, only this time with gray hair, a bad back, and decades of life spent maintaining something that owned them more than they owned it. Munger once said the first rule of compounding is never interrupted unnecessarily. Owning too much house is the perfect interruption. It ties up your capital, your mental energy, and your freedom to make other choices. It keeps you anchored to a job you might hate in a city you don't particularly like, all because you can't risk losing the house. Congratulations, you've built your own prison, and you're both the prisoner and the warden. The irony that Munger loved pointing out is that the truly rich don't brag about their homes. They brag about the deals they passed on, the properties they decided not to buy because the numbers didn't make sense. They understand that liquidity and flexibility are worth more than granite countertops and vaulted ceilings. They'd rather rent freedom, maintain optionality, and keep their capital available for actual investments than own captivity disguised as the American dream. The middle class never sees this perspective. They believe home ownership automatically equals wealth, that signing a mortgage means they've made it. It doesn't. It just guarantees you'll stay busy for decades maintaining the illusion of success while your actual financial flexibility slowly disappears. If you really want to build wealth, you don't need a bigger house. You need a smaller ego, more patience, and the courage to live below what society expects from someone at your income level. Because a humble, affordable home with peace of mind and growing savings beats a showcase mansion with debt and anxiety every single time. The next time someone tells you that renting is throwing money away, ask them this question. What's worse, renting a house or renting your entire life to a mortgage you'll spend 30 years serving? That's the question most people never honestly ask themselves. The middle class loves to say they're investing, but what they really mean is they're speculating badly, chasing trends rather than understanding value. They buy what's popular, not what makes logical sense. They follow headlines, social media hype, and tips from coworkers who are equally confused. And they call this approach strategy when it's really just financial cosplay, playing dress-up as an investor without doing any real work. Munger watched people pour their savings into cryptocurrency, meme stocks, and initial public offerings of companies they couldn't even explain. It's the same psychology that made people chase tulip bulbs in 1637 and technology stocks in 1999. Different packaging, same underlying stupidity. The middle class is obsessed with getting rich quickly because they never built the patience required to get rich slowly. They want Buffett's returns without developing Buffett's temperament. They want Munger's wisdom without enduring Munger's boredom, his willingness to sit and wait while everyone else panicked. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. Wealth isn't built by genius or luck. It's built by sitting still, by staying rational while everyone else loses their minds. But sitting still doesn't look exciting on social media. It doesn't generate likes or envious comments. So people chase constantly, jumping from one opportunity to another like a drunk person switching bars after every drink, always searching for the next thing that will finally work. They say things like you have to take risks to make money, and that's true. But not stupid risks, not risks that can destroy you completely. The market doesn't pay you extra for enthusiasm or activity. Most people don't have an investment problem. They have an impatience problem, an inability to sit with uncertainty, to let time work in their favor. They want the thrill of doing something, the dopamine hit of making a trade, buying a new position, telling people about their latest move. But activity and results are not the same thing. In fact, most of the time they're opposites. The more you trade, the more you react, the worse your returns typically become. Munger once said the big money is not in the buying and selling, but in the waiting. And that's exactly why the middle class never sees it. Waiting looks like doing nothing, and they can't stand that perception. They need to feel productive, active, engaged. They'll tell you they diversified their portfolio, spreading risk intelligently. What they really did was spread ignorance across multiple positions they don't understand. They think diversification protects them. It doesn't. Understanding protects you. You can own a single great business for decades and become genuinely wealthy, or you can own 50 mediocre companies and stay average forever. But mediocrity feels safer because everyone else is doing it, so they choose it again and again. And don't even get started on the financial advice industry, the apparatus designed to extract fees from confused investors. Half of Wall Street exists to make simple ideas sound complicated so they can charge you for your own confusion. They feed you terms like alpha, beta, sharp ratio, acting as if complexity equals intelligence or expertise. It doesn't. Complexity is often just camouflage for mediocrity or outright stupidity. The truth is painfully simple, almost insultingly so. Spend less than you earn. Invest the difference in something you actually understand. Wait patiently while compounding works quietly in your favor over years and decades. That's it. That's the entire formula. The middle class hears that and dismisses it as too boring, too simple, not sophisticated enough. Then they lose.